you've gone. This time I locked my door and realized when it become. You stay with me, but you don't want to end up like this. You still love me, but you will never end up like this.
This is now the keynote presentation, I would say, from zelie, who would explain us the indicators that we have been working on and also give us the context through the intervention logic that we discussed already at the last meeting of the Evaluation Expert Committee. But since only about half of you were there, we would like to repeat some of this information so that the others who weren't at the meeting of the Evaluation Expert Committee have the same level of understanding for the indicator discussion. zelie, please.
Thanks. I'm going to make this a fairly quick presentation because, as Leah's just said, a lot of you are already quite familiar with the proposals on intervention logic, and basically everything that's in this set of slides is included in the background document that was circulated. What's the purpose of the intervention logic? It describes the relationship between the needs established through the SWOT analysis of the territory, the overall objectives, which are drawn as linked to the EU 2020 objectives, the Community Strategic Framework, and the CAP overall objectives, and how the 6 rural development priorities can feed into those, and then how the measures of rural development, the 23 measures, plus, of course, LEADER, contribute through the focus areas and the priorities to achieving the objectives to meet the needs of the region. Now, it's necessarily simplistic. We live in a complex world and there are lots and lots of interactions. So the intervention logic diagrams take a simplistic view of the main links. We're not at all trying to say that other effects and other links don't exist, but if we're trying to structure a program and to determine how money should be spent and what we're trying to achieve, we have to draw some key lines. So it's not an attempt to capture the whole reality. And of course, through evaluations, they can be used to capture further effects, and we would very much encourage that to develop things further. So then very much a key part of the intervention logic is the indicator hierarchy. And there we have a set of context indicators to sort of set the scene: employment, unemployment, some environmental situations, population situation, age, that sort of thing. Then at the level of the objectives, we have the overall impact indicators. And as was mentioned yesterday, the proposal is very much that the impact indicators will be set at the level of the CAP as a whole. It won't be like now where we have the 7 impact indicators just for rural development, but they're set across both pillars of the CAP. But clearly, rural development has more impact on some of those than others. Then the 6 priorities and the focus areas linked to those. This is the level at which the result and the target indicators come in. And because we really want to see what we're achieving in terms of the focus areas, there should be at least 1 target indicator per focus area. So this is our key basic element to see how we're going towards achieving the objective set. And then down at the level of measures and individual operations, this is where we're looking at the output information. So this is the proposed diagram that we've come up with, showing how the 6 rural development priorities feed in to the 3 CAP objectives. You can see that priority 1 at the bottom we see as a horizontal priority, which really feeds in and supports all of the others. And then 2 of the rural development priorities are more specifically linked to viable food production, 2 more to sustainable management of natural resources and climate, and then priority 6 more closely linked to balanced territorial development. Now, I'm certainly not going to read out lists of indicators. If they're in the background document, they will be on the tables when you're working on them. But you'll see in the list that we've put the proposed full list of impact indicators for the CAP, and then we've highlighted those that we see as being particularly relevant where we think that the rural development programmes will make the most contribution. So in terms of viable food production, there are 3. 2 of them I think will be very familiar, and they use concepts that are already familiar and used by Eurostat, and this is something that we have tried to do in the proposals wherever possible, to use existing information, to use existing indicators, to use data that's already collected to avoid additional work and burden. The third one with a question mark there is linked to the innovation, the reskilling, potentially looking at the amount of money spent on agricultural R&D as a percentage of the agricultural GDP, because as you know, one of the EU 2020 targets is that 3% of GDP should be spent on R&D. A longer list here in terms of sustainable management and climate, which since agricultural land covers a large proportion of the EU surface area is not surprising. And then a rather shorter list there in terms of balanced territorial development, where one element of the proposal is that we should be looking at the actual values, rural unemployment, but also comparative values with the rest of the economy, so we can see how the rural areas are doing compared to the rest of the economy. Now, to move into the priorities themselves, there's a diagram for each priority, which is in the documents. Priority 1, as I said, we see this really as a horizontal priority. So we have the 3 measures there for advisory services, for cooperation, for knowledge transfer, and these, although they're specifically linked to priority 1, you will see these already in the other diagrams as well. And this is one reason why for priority 1, we think it would be most appropriate to establish targets on the basis of output indicators, because the results of priority 1 are really going to come through better results to the other priorities. If we're effective at providing advice, at providing training, then the result of that is going to be that what the training is for, if it's for environmental management, if it's for farm performance, will be seen in better environmental management, better farm performance. So that is one specificity of priority 1. Priority 2, the farm competitiveness. Here there's a range of measures, and you may look at those and think, my goodness, there are a lot of other measures that also contribute to that. And that of course, is very true, and you'll see some of those when we move on to priority 3. But this relates to the idea of having a simplistic approach, putting measures and actions where they are most used, where they make most contribution. Proposed results and target indicators here. The underlined ones are the ones that we suggest as potential target indicators. Nothing particularly new there, I don't think. GVA is something that's used at the moment, and I know that there'll be a lot of discussion on that because there have been a lot of issues with that, so we're looking forward to being able to have a discussion on what might work or might not work there. One of the things I should say about the result and target indicators as a whole, as a concept, is that because these have to be monitored, particularly the target indicators, and reported on regularly, it's important that they can be easily obtained. And the concept that we propose is that they are taken at the point of applications coming in and being approved, at which point there'll be a projection, an expectation of what that project or operation is expected to achieve. And this can be done through a combination of information in the application form, perhaps in conjunction with standard coefficients. We're all familiar with concepts such as standard gross margin, standard coefficients for generation of energy from solar panels, this sorts of thing. So relatively simple things using a combination of information in the application form and standard factors to gain an expectation of what will be achieved, and that a sample of completed projects would then be verified during evaluation exercises to see whether the expectations were realised, which could validate the projections and lead, if necessary, to an adjustment if there was a big difference between what was actually realised compared to what was expected. Priority 3. So here we have food chain organisation and risk management. So here, if you were thinking that the slide for priority 2 was looking a bit thin, here you probably find some of the measures that you might have expected to see there. So this just emphasises the simplistic approach, but of course it's recognised that all sorts of activities to improve risk management in agriculture will of course have an effect on improving the competitivity of farms. So then the proposed result and target indicators there. The top 2 are specifically linked to the risk management. We haven't underlined, proposed either of those as target indicators. That's also something that we'd very much like to explore. What sorts of targets would be appropriate to set for risk management? At the bottom, now there are, I said earlier that we were aiming to have really one target indicator per focus area, and there, you see, we have 3 underlined. Some focus areas, and this is a particular example, cover quite a lot of very distinct types of activities. So quality production, short circuit, marketing, producer groups. And it seemed to us in our initial discussions that it was difficult to combine all of those into one target indicator. So there may be cases where it's appropriate to have more than one target indicator for a focus area. Priority 4, very similar to our axis today. So you see that the indicators there that are proposed are again very similar to those that you're familiar with, and those of you who are involved in monitoring and recording under the CMEF will be aware of that sort of breakdown of those area-based measures. Priority 5, this is a very full diagram because there are 5 focus areas here, and here you really see the differences in the approach for the new period compared to the current period, where in the current period we have axes and each measure is really strictly put under one axis. Here, measures can contribute in many different ways because under one measure you can have a lot of different actions, they can contribute to different focus groups, they can contribute to different priorities, which should help to give a more realistic assessment of what's going on. And here the proposed result and target indicators, which this I think highlights very much the approach that we propose of using standard coefficients, because no, it's certainly not envisaged that any applicant coming to install some energy saving equipment would be asked, well, how many tonnes of oil equivalent does this equate to? We're not at all suggesting that. We're not even suggesting that the paying agency or the managing authority should be able to say, well, here's an application form, how many tonnes of oil equivalent does this equate to? That there would be standard coefficients established, set out in guidance, so it would be an automatic calculation for a project coming in for so many metres squared of solar panels, for example, multiplied by the standard coefficient, that this would be equivalent to so many tonnes of oil equivalent saved. Then we have priority 6. Here, I think that the most important thing to say, as was said yesterday as well, is that it's certainly not the intention that leaders should be put in a box and leaders should only be seen as contributing here. LEAD is an approach that can contribute, as we saw in the session yesterday on community-led local development, to all priorities. And the specificity of LEADER is not a limitation in scope, it's a limitation in scale to the territorial area. So LEADER would certainly be expected and be able to contribute across other priorities, but clearly the main focus where we would be able to identify that is perhaps in priority 6. And so these results, target indicators, again, several of them very similar to what we have now, with the addition of the population benefiting from new and improved services and infrastructure, and particularly looking at IT because of the emphasis on innovation, on new technology. So that takes more importance for the new period than perhaps we have had in this period. So just a quick recap here, perhaps particularly for the target indicators, of what we were looking for, the essential characteristics that we think are going to be needed for target indicators to be workable, to be feasible. And this will be something that will come out through the day, particularly in the second and third sessions, I think. So at least one per focus area, because we have to be able to track what's happening in each focus area. It should be very directly linked to the interventions, not affected by external circumstances, changes in the economy, environmental events, that sort of thing. And the values should be simple to calculate and not pose a big burden. Now, this may require a certain amount of initial work in terms of preparation of guidance and this sort of thing, but once that's established, it should be a direct, simple calculation based on data from the application, standard coefficients. So that it can be monitored regularly, that applications as they are approved and then completed can be monitored. And then that the values would be validated through evaluations and adjusted as necessary. So far we've looked at impacts and results, and now we come to outputs. And here, those of you that have had a chance to look at the paper will see that we're really proposing a very different approach to what we have now. At the moment in the CMEF, we have measure-specific output indicators and a varying number for each measure. What we're proposing for the future, and we think this really should be quite a significant simplification, is to work on the basis of data items collected at the level of the operation, the particular project or individual operation in the application form, captured as they are approved and held in the management database. And a lot of these items are things that you need for the management of the program anyway, that you will already be capturing. Who the beneficiary is, how much money the project is applying for. These sorts of things you will have. So we're trying to make use of existing information in a database so that it can be aggregated as required. Whoops. And we've proposed, really, we think these data items fall into 3 categories. There's one group, between 7 and 9, depending on whether we say each operation should really be linked to only one focus area, or whether we acknowledge the reality that many operations will contribute to more than one. These are very basic things like the measure code. You know, at the moment we have our codes 121, 214, etc. We will still have some identification of the measure. The public expenditure. And the main priority that operation is seen as contributing to. And that's all stuff that should be directly identifiable, either from something that the applicant fills in, from something that the managing authority has already established. If there's a call for tenders for a particular type of project, they maybe will be projects for a particular priority. Then there's another group of 10 data items which would cover groups of measures. So, for example, for all the area-based measures, we'd want to know how many hectares were concerned by the application. But clearly, we wouldn't be asking hectares if it's an application to do with training. Again, for all the investment-related measures, we wouldn't only want the public expenditure, but we'd want the total expenditure for the investments because we would want to capture the private contribution. We'd want to be able to look at leverage, for example. And then, even having looked at those, there were some measures for which we felt strongly that there was some additional information needed that was really very measure-specific. For example, for training projects, just the amount of money and the number of trainings delivered, we felt wouldn't be sufficient, that it was important to know the number of training days. For cooperation projects, it was important to know the number of partners who were participating in particular projects. So there are 9 items that you will see which are really tied to very specific measures. This is a very different way of looking at things and something that merits really a lot of discussion. But we really felt that it does have quite a number of significant advantages over the current system. And in the climate, when everybody is concerned about simplification, everybody's concerned about administration burden reduction, and everybody's concerned about cost and resources and being as efficient as possible, we feel that this is valuable and valid. That fewer separate pieces of information will be required. They're easily identified. They're either pre-coded on an application form because it's an application form for a particular measure, or they're taken directly from the application form. The farmer fills in how many meters squared of solar panels he wants to buy. They come from IACS if they're related to area, or they're coded on receipt by the implementing authority according to the type of investment or whatever. They're more strategic than the current output indicators because there's a link between each operation directly to a focus area and priority. And that has added benefits in terms of being able to track expenditure. If we're thinking about tracking environment climate expenditure, if we're thinking about performance, we have that there without having to do an extra exercise. It's already there. So less administration burden because all these things are part of the management database. There doesn't have to be a separate monitoring and evaluation system with a separate aggregation and keeping of the data. But it's flexible because it's a database. You can aggregate as appropriate, and if needs do arise that perhaps were not, or questions that were not necessarily foreseen at the beginning, you would be able to interrogate the database and extract information. And it covers, because it's linked to the management operations database, where you have operations coming in as they're selected and then being closed when they're completed. It covers both selected and completed operations without an additional administrative burden. That was a quick run through that. Now, the very last slide, which means we're almost still on time for coffee, is just a run through again, just a recap of what Leo already introduced as today's main tasks. So to explore the suitability and the feasibility of the proposed indicators, and to identify alternatives where something doesn't work, where there are big problems. We want to draw on your experience, the work you've been doing, your knowledge, to really identify workable alternatives. To look at the feasibility of the proposed approach to the output data and to see what the implications of that would be. And the feasibility of the proposed method for calculating the result indicators, and to identify what else we need to do. Because I'm sure we're going to have a very full day today, but I'm sure that we're not going to finish feeling that the job's completed. So thanks.